tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now goddess, child of Zeus, tell the story for our modern times. Find the beginning. This is how Emily Wilson begins her new translation of Homer's The Odyssey. The Odyssey is one of the most significant poems in human history. It's one of the earliest extant works of literature, and there's so much to say about it. I'm not going to be able to cover it all very well in this video. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the most important things to me in this poem. And the other sort of caveat I'm going to put on this is I am working from Emily Wilson's new translation. I did just recently hear Emily speak about this translation and some of the choices she made and why she made those choices. And so that actually shapes the way that I read the poem. So that's something that's significant, because there are places where other translators have made significantly different choices than some of the ones that Emily made. So I want to start by talking about Odysseus, who's the sort of central figure of this poem. Odysseus's backstory basically is that he's the king of Ithaca, and he's been away at the Trojan War. He was at the Trojan War for 10 years before he finally came up with the idea of creating the wooden horse, the famous wooden horse that the Greeks built, and then a bunch of them piled inside it, and the Trojans brought it inside the city, and at night the Greeks came out and slaughtered them all, thus winning the Trojan War. This is recounted in the Iliad, and it's the backstory to the Odyssey. So, by the time that the Odyssey begins, most of the people who fought in the Trojan War have gone home already. Odysseus has not. He's been trapped on the oceans in this long journey. Well, I say trapped on the ocean. When we first sort of meet him, he's spent 7 years on an island with the goddess Calypso, having sex with her every night. So, which, I mean, if you're going to be sort of trapped on an island for 7 years, that's probably the way that you want to spend it, trapped on an island. But this is actually really significant, I think, in terms of how we measure Odysseus's character. But he's been trapped on this island for 7 years. The other gods get together and say, Calypso, you need to let Odysseus go home. And so she's like, fine, not really pleased about it, but Zeus and Athena and Apollo and Hermes and everybody have said I have to, so Odysseus can go. He goes, he has another sort of 3 years worth of adventures, basically. He goes to different places and lives at different people's courts. He kills a lot of people. All of his men get destroyed eventually in various ways. And then finally, around book 13, he makes it back to his own kingdom of Ithaca, which is in sort of the western, it's an island off the west coast of Greece. And that's where Odysseus is from. That's where he spent the whole first 12 books or whatever it is trying to get back to. And he finally gets back there to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, and a bunch of suitors who sort of said, hey, Odysseus has been gone for almost 20 years, let's all move into his house and try and woo his wife. He's probably dead. So she's pretty sexy, and they've got a lot of property. This seems like a great deal. Telemachus is too young to sort of fight them off or fend them off or whatever it is. And Penelope is in this sort of weird position where she can't necessarily say, get out of my house, I don't want you here. But she also is devoted to Odysseus. So then the final sort of 12 books or so of the poem are basically Odysseus being home in Ithaca and just sort of pretending he's other people in order to trick everyone and sort of slowly revealing who he is to person after he tests whether or not they're loyal to him, and then brutally slaughtering everybody who's not, or whom he judges not to be loyal to him. So Emily starts her translation by calling him a complicated man, and that's definitely true. I think maybe more accurate, though, would be to call him a hypocritical man. Now, I don't have a very high opinion of Oedipus, of Odysseus. I'll tell you that straight out. I don't like this character, in part because I think he's extremely hypocritical. So he's very, very clever. That's one of his character traits, and there's a lot of language in here about him coming up with ideas, him being cunning, him loving lies, loving deception, and things like this. And it's off. So he's associated with Athena. Athena is his great protector, and Athena is a goddess of strategic cunning. And so that's very central to who Odysseus is, and we can't understand him without understanding that element of him. But he often uses that cunning for reasons that he doesn't really need to. The great example of this, I think, is actually in book 24, the last book of the poem, where he's brutally murdered all of the suitors who were eating his food and drinking his wine and trying to marry his wife. He's brutally killed these slave girls, who I'll talk more about in a little bit. And then he goes out to his dad, who's been, like, I don't know, living this, like, pastoral, impoverished life, just, like, weeping for his lost son. I get a kind of, like, Vito Corleone vibe at the end of The Godfather, where he's sitting in his orchard with his grandson, and he's just sort of old and broken down and sad. But anyway, that's just my impression of the dad. But like Odysseus goes to his dad and he's like, hey, I'm this guy from, I think at that point he's saying I forget where he's saying he's from. I think he says he's like from Egypt or something like that. And he's like, yeah, Odysseus stopped by my house like 3 years ago. Haven't seen him since. Thought I'd just, drop in on you for a visit. And Odysseus's dad is like, I'm so sad because my son is gone. He's probably dead. And then finally Odysseus is like, yeah, JK, it was me. I had no real good reason to pretend I was somebody else, but I did it because I'm kind of a dick like that. So that's one example, but generally Odysseus doesn't necessarily use his cunning to be dickish. He generally uses it to survive. But one of the things that I find so hypocritical about Odysseus and the way that he treats other characters has to do with the concept of xenia, which has to do with strangers. It's where we get the term xenophobia, which is fear of strangers, or xenophilia, which is unfortunately not as common, which is the love of strangers. Now, the thing that you have to understand with this is that in the ancient world, there were no hotels, there were no inns, you couldn't, like, go and give somebody money and they would give you a bed and stuff like that for the night. When you traveled to different places, you depended on people to offer you hospitality. Of course, this was like rich people offering other rich people hospitality. This wasn't, generally speaking, like random farmers and sheep herders and stuff traveling all over the world. But that definitely did happen. I mean, you did have merchants, you did have traders and things like that. And you had people who were not particularly tied to one area. But the idea of offering hospitality and of being a good host and of being a good guest was really important in the ancient world, because and this was all about reciprocity. So the idea was like, you would come and I would offer to let you stay in my home and eat some of my food and things like this. And then later on, I would go elsewhere in the world and somebody would offer me a bed and food and whatever it is. And not murder me in my sleep was a sort of implicit component of this. Xenia was a big thing for the Greeks. They were very concerned with this. And we see that continually throughout the Odyssey. Because one of the things, whenever Odysseus or his son Telemachus or whoever it is goes to a new kingdom, particularly a good kingdom, one of the first things that people ask is, or one of the first things they attempt to ascertain is, are you going to be hospitable to strangers? And Odysseus is continually judging people based on how hospitable they are to strangers. So he expects people to be good hosts when he shows up. And then this is actually also part of why the suitors being in Odysseus's house is such a huge problem, is because they're there without his permission, they're eating his food without his permission, they're courting his wife, obviously without his permission, since he's obsessed with Penelope not sleeping with anybody else while he's gone, even though he sleeps with a ton of other people while he's gone, most notably Calypso, who he has sex with for 7 years. So that's another element of his hypocrisy, is the fact that so much attention in the poem is paid to Penelope not getting any, while Odysseus is out having sex with gods and or goddesses and princesses and what all. But this issue of Xenia is really important because the suitors are clearly bad guests. And so that's part of the reason Odysseus brutally slaughters them. But what's hypocritical to me, and there's different ways of reading this, what's hypocritical to me is that Odysseus is himself so often a bad guest and is, at the end of the poem, essentially a bad host, that the fact that he's continually judging people for whether or not they are good hosts, whether or not they're hospitable to guests, I find it very, very hard to buy. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The Cyclops is a fantastic example of this. The Cyclops lives more or less alone, like there's other Cyclopses on the island, but he basically lives in a cave with his sheep and animals and things like this. He's not an agriculturalist, he's a herder, and so this is part of the reason, probably, that the Greeks were okay with seeing him as a sort of uncultured barbarian who it wasn't that big a deal if Odysseus destroyed. But when they get... So Odysseus and his crew land on the island, they go to this Cyclops' cave, and without asking, without seeking permission, without waiting, they go into the cave and they start eating the Cyclops' food. That's not a good guest. Like, wait to be invited, wait to be offered stuff. So they go in and they start taking his stuff, and it's not necessarily clear that he would have had any intention of offering it. Now, we never know that because when he gets back, he finds them there, finds out that they've eaten his food, and he starts to eat them. So he's not a good host. Well, that's a totally fair critique. The Cyclops is a bad host. But Odysseus and his crew are not good guests. And so, as much as it's not sort of justified to eat a bunch of Odysseus's crew members with the intention of eating the rest of them, Odysseus isn't sort of practicing the value of being a good guest, which is a crucial part of Xenia. And then, of course, he takes basically an olive tree, sharpens the end of it up, fire hardens it, and stabs out the Cyclops' eye, thus blinding him before stealing all of his sheep and stuff like this. So he's really a fairly shitty guest, as guests go. And of course, this is par for the course for Odysseus, because we know that he's plundered other places. We find that out beforehand. That, like, basically he and his men leave from destroying Troy, go to another town, raise that town, steal all their stuff, and then head merrily along their way. And then, so we have that sort of, that inversion, or we have that example of sort of failure of Xenia with the Cyclops, and also with the previous towns Odysseus has destroyed. But what's really striking to me about the Cyclops episode is that, in effect, it parallels what happens when Odysseus gets home. The suitors are there eating his food without his permission. They're not sort of welcome to his stuff. And so Odysseus becomes the ultimate bad host in that he brutally murders them all. There are even some of them who, like, come and beg him for mercy and say, hey man, I wasn't trying to marry your wife, I really didn't have anything to do with this. And Odysseus is basically like, too bad you're here, now I'm going to kill you. And so it's just an absolute bloodbath. And so Odysseus, who has spent the whole poem basically judging every group of people he comes into contact with based on whether or not they offer hospitality to strangers, then brutally murders the sort of entire young adult, early middle-aged male population of Ithaca, all of whom have been there being bad guests. So he returns their bad guestness with bad hostness. And so, and this is, I think, very characteristic of Odysseus's approach to things. He's very much a sort of self-centered character who expects to be revered, expects to be honored, expects to be treated well, without necessarily, and expects Penelope to be sexually faithful to him, without necessarily feeling like he needs to return any of those values. So there's that element. The other thing that I do want to talk about, and my sense is that this is unique to Emily's translation, is the way in which the murder of the slave girls is dealt with. And I think this is book 22. I may be able to find it. I should have marked it. Yeah. So the slave girls. There's this set of female slaves that Odysseus owns, and he was a slave owner, and in the ancient world there was nothing unusual about that. People wouldn't have had the same sort of moral repugnance that we have to it today. But there's this group of, I think it's 12 or 15 young women who have been having sex with the suitors, and Odysseus orders Telemachus, after the suitors have all been murdered, to kill them. And Odysseus says, hack at them with long swords, eradicate all life from them. They will forget the things the suitors made them do in secret through Aphrodite. So this is an interesting passage. So, because one of the things that a lot of previous translations have done is treat this as though it's a matter of promiscuity, or almost sexual infidelity to Odysseus. So a lot of translations, including like Robert Fagles and people like this who produce very famous, widely read translations, describe them as sluts or whores or strumpets or whatever it is. That's a very 19th century kind of attitude in a way. Like, the thing is that, and one of the other things that Emily talked about, both in her talk that I heard and the introduction to this book, is that a lot of other translations play down the fact that these are not servants, these are not sort of hired people, these are slaves. But that's a very important point, because if they're slaves, they don't have bodily autonomy. So in the ancient world, the notion that, like, so if you think of these women as servants, then they have some freedom of choice. They could say, no, I don't want to have sex with you. If they're slaves, and slaves in the ancient world were, one of the responsibilities of slaves in the ancient world was to have sex with their owners or their guests. If we keep that context in mind, it doesn't make that much sense to say, they had sex with the suitors, and that in itself is bad. So this line, they will forget the things the suitors made them do with them in secret through Aphrodite, is actually a really interesting point, because what Emily suggests is that this is about eradicating the memory of the suitors and the period when the suitors were there. So, but then so that's part of this thing. Part of the thing that Emily does that's so interesting in this translation is she actually gives these sometimes minor characters, sometimes less socially empowered characters, their own sort of empathetic treatment. So there's a temptation, I think, with epic poetry to sort of treat the hero of the poem as this sort of superhero who's going around and doing these great feats and fighting monsters and making this epic journey and things like this. But he's really quite a brutal guy, and part of the horrendous murder of these slave women is about, I think, reestablishing his absolute authority over his home, even to the point where those who remember the suitors, and these women, of course, would always be a reminder that the suitors had been there. The sexual aspects of the suitors would live in these women's mind, and so they have to be destroyed for that reason. And Book 22 is a horrendous book in many ways. The slaughter of the suitors is very, very graphic and violent. And then Telemachus, in one of the few decisions he makes for himself without input from someone else, decides not to kill the women with swords. He takes a rope and hangs them. And it's this really crushing scene. I mean, it's the way that Odysseus approaches the world. I mean, he has to have absolute control over his world, and the fact that he is a bad guest, the fact that he is a liar, the fact that he's sexually unfaithful to his wife, on and on and on, doesn't really seem to change his expectations that others will be good hosts, that others will be good guests, that his wife will be faithful to him, etc., etc. He wants to be treated in the proper way, but he also doesn't really treat others in the proper way unless they've substantially proven that no matter what, they're going to treat him the way he expects to be treated. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think Emily's translation is a beautiful, beautiful translation, and I could talk about the technique of it, the sort of technical aspects of her translation, but I'm not going to, because this video is getting too long as it is. It's a beautiful poem, but I think Odysseus is an absolute dick. I don't like him at all. I don't like Telemachus either. He's also supposed to be an admirable figure, and I don't care for either of them. Thanks.